Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Over a year ago, I received this comment under my video, "It's time to move on." Open brackets. Fans of Critic YouTube are not seeking good entertainment. Close brackets. I will leave the comment on the screen for everyone to read, but I will try quickly to summarize the main points. In the past, fictional media, stories, games, films, books, etc., were used as a form of escapism and were thus much cooler than current media today. Additionally, people used to touch grass more frequently and engage with other human beings. Today, however, media are used to take the place of touching grass and engaging with other human beings, and so are not being used for escapism, but instead as replacements for real-life stimuli. Back then, I used this as a springboard on Twitter to talk about some thoughts I had on what I call self-referentialism, which you can read here. Since I thought my concept of self-referentialism was useful for discussing particular trends in media, I have decided that I should expound on the idea in this video essay. Firstly, what do I mean by the term self-referentialism? You won't find it in a dictionary, and every word processor on the planet will tell you that referentialism isn't a real word. However, referential is a real word and has two definitions according to the Cambridge Online Dictionary. 1. If a word, phrase, text, etc. is referential, it is used to refer to a particular person or thing. 2. Making a reference to or mentioning another writer, text, film, etc. Here's my basic definition for self-referentialism. This definition will be elaborated in the course of this essay. Self-referentialism, the practice or habit of creating art and media, stories, novels, films, etc., which are consciously derivative of art and media in the same genre, resulting in the creation of media that are decidedly uninspired, unoriginal, and generic. Now, some may ask if what I am describing is intertextuality, and whether I am just inventing a new term for no reason. Of course, what I have described is an example or type of intertextuality, but the reason I'm coining and defining the term self-referentialism is simple. Intertextuality covers all kinds and instances of references in fiction, including good and bad examples. In short, it is a general term. I am using self-referentialism as a term because it covers a specific, extremely derivative form of intertextuality. After hearing my definition for self-referentialism and how it is a specific term for derivative intertextuality, some may predict that I am about to tirade against the latest remake, sequel, spin-off, mainstream media slop you can view courtesy of your local cinema, or, increasingly, one of the numerous streaming platforms available. It would be a safe prediction. What could be more self-referential than the latest Star Wars series on Disney+, for example? However, I'm afraid I will have to disappoint some people. I'm not going to discuss Star Wars for 3 reasons. The first is because I said in the ending segment of this video, I am now done with Disney Star Wars, and I meant it. The second is because in these 2 videos, I argue the case for moving on from mainstream media and seeking the new. And third, because I am not interested in discussing the cynical and conscious self-referentialism of creatively bankrupt companies designed to attract as many eyeballs as possible. Instead, I'm interested in discussing the tendency of writers in general to practice self-referentialism, sometimes inadvertently. In my original Twitter thread, I used mainstream anime to demonstrate my points regarding the nature of self-referentialism, and I shall do so again in this video. The anime industry is incredibly self-referential. Most anime series are adapted from manga series, which are adapted from light novels, which are born in the imagination of a Japanese writer who is inspired by the anime and manga series which he consumes, which were in turn inspired by light novels, which were inspired by other anime, and so on and so forth in a positive feedback loop. This doesn't even include the interactions between different anime series that create even more feedback loops. The same is true with manga. This is why we can play anime bingo when engaging with anime and manga media, and is also why we can point at a character and say, this character type is a tsundere, or a yandere, etc. Or, this anime male protagonist is a fantastic, weak anime male. If you're wondering what a character type is, or what a fantastic, weak anime male is, please watch these videos. We can also make bets on when the male protagonist will accidentally grope the love interest, or walk in on her in a state of undress, or when the tsundere will physically abuse him. Such is the blatant referential nature of anime and manga that the same tropes appear again and again. Because of the recurrent tropes, it is often said that anime and manga are a genre. This is mostly accurate, but I believe it would be more precise to say that anime and manga are a meta-genre. It doesn't matter if you are reading a light novel about vampires in a secondary school, or an isekai manga, or watching a science fiction anime series with giant mecha. These tropes will appear despite the fact that these media are technically in separate genres. For a recent example of an anime which is not self-referential, we only need to look at Spy X Family. Spy X Family is an anime series, of course, and does have a number of anime tropes, such as characters like Anya having naturally pink hair and big eyes, and inner monologues are common enough. However, Spy X Family is not self-referential at its core. Just by watching the series, you can tell that the mangaka, who made the manga from which the anime was adapted, was inspired by spy media, among other things. For instance, there is a James Bond reference in Anya Forger, who the narrator tells us was a test subject. Subject 007. And even the animated show she watches on television is a reference to Ian Fleming's work, as the main character is called Bondman. Further on this point, while there are clear references to Western spy media, it isn't derivative of Western spy media. It would be inaccurate to say that the characters in Spy X Family are discount versions of the characters you would find in Fleming's books, for instance. But honing back on the discussion of self-referentialism, Spy X Family does not look to other manga or anime or light novels for its ideas and script. If you play Anime Bingo, you will find that the series doesn't follow the anime meta-genre conventions. If you are expecting to find a fantastic weak anime male as the lead, an accidental groping scene, a predominantly secondary school setting, teenage main characters, or tsundere, kundere, etc. character types in Spy X Family, you are going to be disappointed. Spy X Family may be a mainstream anime, but it is a very different breed to its competitors. Now, far from how it might appear, I'm not arguing that self-referentialism is only found in Japanese media. We can see the same phenomenon in Western media, in superhero films and comics, and in fantasy literature. Some time ago, I read 2 fantasy novels which were set in the Forgotten Realms universe, Darkwalker on Moonshae and The Crystal Shard. Both books were engaged in self-referentialism, or in other words, they rigidly followed high fantasy genre conventions. To say that the books were inspired by J.R.R. Tolkien and Robert E. Howard would be to credit the authors, Douglas Neils and R.A. Salvatore, respectively, way too much. Inspiration is one thing, including sections, characters, races, and ideas which rip off Tolkien and Howard and don't develop any new ideas, thoughts, feelings, or explore new themes, is quite another. Now, the Forgotten Realms universe is a Dungeons & Dragons setting, perhaps the most famous Dungeons & Dragons setting of all, and Dungeons & Dragons is known to be deliberately derivative of Tolkien and Howard, and of history, and old fairy tales, and myths. But it works in a tabletop role-playing game context, because when you are playing a game with friends and or relatives, the goal is to have fun, rather than to craft a story which explores deep themes and ideas. As a player, it is perfectly acceptable to base your dwarf fighter on Gimli, or your human ranger on Aragorn, or your human barbarian on Conan, and as a dungeon master, it is perfectly acceptable to decide that the plot of your campaign is finding a legendary sword which can only be drawn from a stone by the true king of the land, or to make adventuring across multiple realms and countries the goal of your campaign. Being part of a derivative TRPG campaign can be tremendous fun because it is stimulating to play with the tropes. It is not stimulating to watch somebody else play them for you on the pages of a novel as if it were a paint-by-numbers guide. Now, at this juncture, some members of my audience might be dying to ask me a question. Your Imperial Majesty, you've been using the terms self-referential and self-referentialism to describe derivative anime series and fantasy books at length now. But why use the terms self-referential and self-referentialism when they both exist under the well-known and understood concept of derivativeness, or being derivative? Did you just want to use a newly minted term? There are two answers to this question. The first is yes, and the second is actually no. The difference between being derivative and being self-referential is the difference between singular phenomena and mass phenomena, and the extent of the derivativeness. Or put another way, when a lone writer creates a story which heavily borrows copies, the cliches, tropes, conventions, etc., from a specific genre, his story is derivative. When a mass collective of writers within a genre borrow and copy from each other and former authors so extensively that all their stories start to look similar and come to define the genre, then their stories become self-referential. What is more, when a genre becomes self-referential, it starts to influence the writers within its orbit to construct stories which are increasingly formulaic and uninspired. The genre and its conventions become an end in and of themselves, rather than a means of telling a story which a writer wants to tell. Suggesting that a genre is a means to tell a specific story which a writer wants to tell may sound strange at first. We are more accustomed to hearing that genres only exist for markability purposes, but I'd argue that genres have mostly developed as toolsets for the benefit of the writer. For example, Isaac Asimov wrote I, Robot, a set of stories exploring the possible positive and negative consequences of developing ever more sophisticated and artificially intelligent robots, and to propose a set of laws designed to prevent pain and suffering from being inflicted on humanity by robotic technologies. In theory, Isaac Asimov could have written his story in the fantasy genre. He could have written I, Iron Golem, for instance, and magic could have mapped as a direct metaphor for advanced science and technology, and the golems could have been analogies for potential robots in the future. His proposed laws would then be laws of magic, rather than robotics. Asimov could have done this, and while a fantasy version of I, Robot probably would have worked, it wouldn't have met his purposes as clearly and precisely as the actual version, because the science fiction genre was better suited to telling his stories. Asimov wanted to tell a specific set of stories, and he wanted to explore a specific grouping of ideas and possibilities, and the science fiction genre was the perfect means of doing what he wanted to do as a writer. This is what it looks like when a writer uses a genre for his creativity. A derivative anime series is what it looks like when the meta-genre of anime and manga uses a writer for his creativity. Rather than the writer using the anime meta-genre to tell the story he wants to tell, it almost acts like a parasite and uses him to proliferate its tropes and cliches in the phenomenon of self-referentialism. Mangakas, animators, writers, etc. become so engrossed with the anime and manga meta-genre that they paint by the numbers when creating characters, plots, and aesthetics, because, in their view, these tropes and conventions are the goal of the story, and not the means to tell the story. It will help my explanation if I now give a more formal and elaborate definition to my term, self-referentialism. First, the basic definition I provided at the beginning of the video. Self-referentialism, the practice or habit of creating art and media, stories, novels, films, etc., which are consciously derivative of art and media in the same genre, resulting in the creation of media that are decidedly uninspired, unoriginal, and generic. And now the more formal and elaborated definition. Self-referentialism, Sense 1, a phenomenon in creative industries where the collective of creators within a genre reference each other's texts to the point that the whole genre becomes derivative and its media become increasingly generic due to excessive intertextuality. Sense 2. The phenomenon where a genre's conventions exercise such a powerful influence on a creator that, by using the aforementioned genre, his story becomes fundamentally derivative and perpetuates the ossified tropes of the genre in question. Continuing with the main essay, the self-referentialism present in many modern fantasy novels may not be as strong or as blasé as in anime, but it is still palpable. However, I must stress that, while the derivative usage of the same tropes, generic conventions, and character types is a defining characteristic in the work of the self-referential artist, it isn't the worst offending feature. The actual problem is the lack of expression and creative exploration, which leaves a black hole in the self-referential story, and that void is always felt. Great writers and artists are able to take the most basic ideas and themes, and are even able to employ many old tropes and generic conventions, while still creating illuminating and thrilling works of art and media. Creating art is easy. Creating great or even just good art is much harder, and there is no scientific formula or set of rules you can follow to successfully create great art. However, one thing which is observable is that great creators always bring new insights and perspectives to whatever they explore in their creations. Take Robert E. Howard's Conan the Barbarian stories as an example. Although he is the most famous writer of the old pulp era, Howard wasn't the only writer in the sword and sorcery pulp fiction genre. Unsurprisingly then, the plots of his stories are not too different in substance than other stories in the same genre. Worlds far off in time and space, adventure, action, violence, treasure, romance, supermasculine man as the protagonist, gorgeous women, etc. But the reason I believe he is remembered is because his stories actually express and explore a genuine belief of his. For those who don't know, Howard had rather negative thoughts on civilization and is famous for this quote: "Barbarianism is the natural state of mankind. Civilization is unnatural. It is the whim of circumstance, and barbarianism must ultimately triumph." This line can be found in his Conan story Beyond the Black River in Chapter 8. And it isn't said by Conan. The conflict between civilization and barbarism is not just a one-off thing in this one story. It is a recurring theme throughout the Conan stories. Howard loves putting the vices of civilized men on display and contrasting them against the virtues of Conan, the noble barbarian. Now, the Conan stories, like most of their contemporaries, are action-packed, romantic, and fantastic. But I think the real thematic weight behind Howard's tales is in his exploration of the differences between civilized man and barbaric man. Many readers will consciously miss the messages which Howard delivers with his tales, but I believe even these readers will have subconsciously been affected by his ideas on this topic. The Conan stories remind us that civilization, while perhaps good as a whole, has its vices. Meanwhile, in Dungeons & Dragons, most people who pick the barbarian class for their player character do so because the rage ability makes you deal a lot of damage, and their preferred roleplay is, "I am easily angered and gravitate towards being a murder hobo." And unfortunately, most beginner writers who decide to write barbarian characters end up making something very similar. Both copy the Conan aesthetic without understanding the underlying spirit behind it. This is why I always cringe internally whenever I talk to someone online or in real life who says he is going to write a story based on his Dungeons & Dragons campaigns or characters. While it is far from impossible to write a good story with those inspirations, there are many pitfalls, and the majority of them are all connected to a tunnel network leading to the dark abyss of self-referentialism. Boiled down adventure plots, which the DM ripped from a TV series, characters inspired purely by classes found in the player's handbook, or any number of expansions released by Wizards of the Coast, aesthetics decided upon by reference to illustrated fantasy books, etc. These are all traps. Here is where we take a brief break in our essay. I not only make YouTube video essays, I'm also an author. I have published a number of books over the years under a pen name. If you enjoy books by C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and Philip Pullman, I can recommend my family-friendly books Earl the Dragon Slayer, Escape from Labyrinth, and The Northward Journey. Escape from Labyrinth and The Northward Journey are part of a trilogy, and the third book is going to be released in February next year. If you enjoy pulp fiction books by writers such as Robert E. Howard, then you may enjoy my short story Rodgerhath and the Goldenaxe. Finally, if you're a fan of Terry Pratchett, then you may enjoy my novella The Pub on the Other Side of the Forest. This story is Terry Pratchett on steroids. All these books can be bought on Amazon or Kobo, in either ebook form or paperback. I have made audio previews of all these stories and uploaded them on this YouTube channel. Links are in the description. Alright, let's continue with the essay. Now, among some of the ladies and gentlemen in my audience, there may be some frustration, and perhaps some boredom. All I have done for the past 20 minutes is do typical analysis on bad writing practices, used my own terminology to describe the phenomena, and not so subtly made arguments about why these practices are bad. And yet I haven't even begun to address the interesting question which must surely be floating in everyone's mind by now. Why is self-referentialism such a common snare, and how does a writer avoid it? To answer the first part of this question, we need to consider what makes great stories great. Here we could lose ourselves in the weeds rather easily, because there is never ever one thing which makes a tale enthralling or brilliant. But we might save ourselves some time by looking past the great stories we all enjoy and instead studying their creators. I have mentioned that great writers tend to bring new insights and perspectives to the world with their work, and I'd like to expand on this. For many of the great artists and writers of our age and ages past, creativity was a means of exploring new ideas and possibilities, and of sharing something of themselves with the world. Art was a means of expression of emotions, feelings, and ideas, and sometimes musings of great philosophical insight, spirituality, and moral meditation. Great art is great, not only because of its entertainment value and impeccable construction, but also because it shares essential truths which help us understand and navigate the world like a compass at sea. In short, great art has meaning. Art which is simply good or sufficient only seeks to entertain us. It doesn't exist to do any of the previous things I have mentioned. Many beginner writers and artists get inspired by great art and want to create something similar, but they make the mistake of not engaging or understanding the meaning behind the works which have lit the fire of creativity within them. If you don't understand the philosophies, religion, and beliefs behind writers, such as Tolkien and Lewis, for instance, you will miss out on the crucial influences which inspired their stories and imbued them with such meaning and power. The beginner writer oftentimes only engages with the meaning of a great story subconsciously, and this is dangerous because you have to be mindful that stories have the ability to sway your beliefs, otherwise you can be influenced by their power without your knowledge. So if beginner writers often look past the meaning of a story, then what do they look at instead? What are they inspired by? Well, they are inspired by the surface level, the construction, the story's presentation, the entertainment, and the emotions and feelings the tale stirs within them. But like the average man who goes to buy a car and makes his final decision based on a given vehicle's fuel efficiency, speed, look, and feel, how it feels to drive that is, he will appreciate the car, but he won't understand it fully. But a car engineer who buys the same car for the same reasons will actually understand how it all works together, and what is under the bonnet, and appreciate the vehicle on a deeper and more informed level. To understand a story's meaning, you need to do more than simply examine good writing techniques, plot structure, and character dialogue. Of course, you will have to examine these things, as it is a great way, and perhaps the first way, to start uncovering the meaning of a story. But if a beginner writer doesn't do more than this, then he will fall into the snare of self-referentialism, because he will only copy the surface elements of the stories that have inspired him, and make a story without the depth of meaning, and devoid of his own thoughts, observations, ideas, and feelings. Like the man who sees some cars, feels inspired to weld one himself, and makes an aggressive-looking vehicle with a sleek chassis and comfy interior, but also without a functional engine. Okay, that never happens, but hopefully everyone understands my point here. To help demonstrate what a self-referential story written by a beginner looks like, let's examine The Crystal Shard, the first book in the Icewind Dale trilogy, by R.A. Salvatore. I have described it previously as self-referential, and it is time I justify my assessment. I don't want to do an in-depth analysis or review of The Crystal Shard, because that is not the purpose of this video. So let us look at the main characters of the book in no particular order, and how the story is a product of self-referentialism. We'll start with the dwarf character, Brenor Battlehammer. Brenor is a dwarf who fights with axes and hammers, presents himself as a tough and stoic individual, but really has a big heart and feels emotions strongly. He is also an outcast who was settled in Icewind Dale because he and his clan were exiled from the Mountain Hall kingdom of Mithril Hall. Hello Gimli, hello Thorin, and hello Balin. I would say I'm surprised to see you, but I'm not. Brenor is also a blacksmith, and forges a marvellous magical warhammer called Aegisfang for his slave. Speaking of which, Wulfgar is the son of a barbarian chieftain who is taken captive by Brenor in battle and held as an indentured servant for 5 years and taught in the way of the dwarves and civilized to an extent. There is really nothing to say about Wulfgar other than he is a barbarian and he fights well, but he also uses his brain. Then there is another human adopted by Brenor, I don't know where he finds them, a woman called Catti Bray. It is an awful name, and she deserves it. She is a strong-willed woman who wants to fight and do as the men male dwarves do. Picture a really bland Eowyn without the feminine grace, and you have Catti Bray, a typical strong, independent late 80s or early 90s fantasy warrior woman in the waiting. I try not to forget Rhaegus, but he is by far the worst character and is effortlessly forgettable. Rhaegus is a halfling rogue, and all he wants to do is fish, nap, eat, and drink, but the plot of the story just won't allow him to be a lazy waste of space. Imagine a hobbit, but without the charm and virtue, and you have Rhaegus. Finally, let's talk about Drizzt, the one and only, who has spawned tens of thousands of edgy copies in D&D campaigns the world over. He is a drow, or a dark elf, but a noble one, who has forsaken the Underdark and roams Icewind Dale as a ranger, killing evil creatures. Despite the fact that no one trusts him on the surface and actually mistreat him on occasion, he bears it all like a saint, and continues with his good deeds. How did a drow, brought up in the Underdark, in a society rotten, evil, and vice-ridden to the core, come to the realization that the ways of his ethnic group were abominable? Was it natural law? A law written on men's hearts which can be deduced by reason? Did Drizzt always know in his heart that the traditions and practices of his civilization were against a higher law? Did he have a series of lengthy ethics debates with a high elf cleric about good and evil and find himself swayed? What are his motivations? What are his ambitions? For what purpose is he doing good? If you are hoping for a satisfying or interesting explanation for Drizzt's turn to the light, both physical and moral, and answers for the rest of these questions, I'm afraid you are going to be disappointed, as the author doesn't provide anything. What's worse is Drizzt has a dull personality, so he doesn't even make for an interesting protagonist. As can be gleaned, all these characters are self-referential to the high fantasy genre, derivative of great writers such as Tolkien and Howard, but also of other contemporary fantasy writers at the time, who were also copying Tolkien and Howard. The cliches, tropes, and unadulterated genericness are refined so thoroughly in these characters that you know everything about them before you even start reading. Salvatore acts as a cipher for the high fantasy genre, strengthening its tropes and conventions without providing any meaning or substance himself. It's almost as if he is not being his own writer, but instead a ghostwriter for the fantasy genre. My honest experience with The Crystal Shard was one of boredom with a couple of eye rolls. I liked Drizzt's pet panther, or animal companion as they are called in D&D, not to be confused with familiars, and that is the only positive thing I can say. There is nothing to engage with, nothing to think about, nothing to dwell on, and no unique enriching experiences to be gained from reading it. Time spent reading The Crystal Shard could be spent reading a better story. The real tragedy of The Crystal Shard is the same tragedy that is shared by all self-referential media, that they are uninspired, unthinking half-copies of great stories, and so lack all the meaning, substance, and originality of their predecessors. Self-referential media are never worthy or memorable additions to the genre which they reference and inhabit. They aren't original creations in a true sense. They are basically copycats, and as a consequence, they have no meaning. Now, I want to defend R.A. Salvatore here. It may seem that I am ragging on the writer himself rather than his first book, but I want to make clear here that, in my opinion, R.A. Salvatore doesn't have to be ashamed of writing The Crystal Shard. Not only was it his first ever published novel, but, because of the nature of the project, it had to be self-referential. R.A. Salvatore was recruited by Tactical Studies Rules, or TSR, to write The Crystal Shard, set in the Forgotten Realms, Faerun, Dungeons & Dragons setting. He was hired to write a story set in a self-referential high fantasy world, which was literally only ever designed to act as a platform for Dungeons & Dragons campaigns. Considering the nature of the setting, the only stories Salvatore could possibly write would be self-referential, and judging by the reported 1.5 million sales of the first two books in the trilogy, it was exactly what the market wanted and what TSR needed. Now, to answer the second part of the question, how does one avoid creating a self-referential story? I have 15 points of practical advice which I shall share on the screen for everyone to read at his or her convenience. Please do feel free to pause the video. But here are the two most important pieces of advice which I think will help. First, whenever you engage with media you like or dislike, actually engage with them. Try to figure out what the creators are trying to say, or even what they are not trying to say, and determine how their beliefs and desires to express certain ideas, feelings, and notions affects and informs the work which you see in front of you. Also consider watching videos, reading statements and biographies of your favourite creators to discover what they desired to achieve with their works and what inspired them. It is always best to get it from the horse's mouth. No matter what you've been told, the death of the author has been greatly exaggerated. Second, and perhaps most importantly, before you put pen to paper, you should ask yourself the following. What do I hope to achieve with this story? What do I want to express? What do I want to explore? Why should this story exist? If you cannot answer these questions, I would advise you to hold your horses and find the answers before writing. The answers don't have to be profound necessarily. The answer can literally be entertainment and fun for all four of them. You probably won't create great art if those are your answers, but you can certainly create good art with such motivations. In any case, whatever you decide or whatever answers you find to these questions, it is imperative that whatever you choose to express comes from the heart, and that you explore what you want to explore. The sentiments, hopes, fears, and dreams in your stories have to be genuine, and they have to be yours. There is no point in writing a story where the good guys win in the end if you truly believe that only bad guys win in the real world, because your story will only come across as fake and forced. It doesn't matter that stories where evil triumphs over good are not popular with audiences. You have to express what you truly feel and believe, and not simply imitate others because your work might not, quote-unquote, sell. With art, you have to be yourself. Everyone else is taken. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you all for watching. I hope you all have an excellent day.